We're back this week with a conversation with Gueric Dechavanne. Gueric is the Vice President and part owner of Collateral Verifications. He's also an ISTAT Certified Senior Appraiser. There's a lot of value in the actual experience of somebody who's seen, the industry for years. I'm not calling you old, but I kind of did.
That's right.
To that context, and really what I'm getting to here are those prior crises. And I know that you put together a couple of slides kind of talking about those and how that frames the picture for the way that you look at this current crisis.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think those are great indicators of what could be. And so from that standpoint, right, it does, if we start to see similarities in terms of where the supply is being pushed to or how the markets are changing, then it can kind of give you a sense for, normally on the in production things, they're going to be less affected based on the fact that obviously the airlines will probably, try to keep those operating versus older aircraft, which are easier to retire. And so those are going to have a greater impact. So I think looking at, kind of the previous downturns to show some of the differences in terms of how steep some of the discounts could be. I think that's certainly helpful to kind of go, look, some of the older stuff, yeah, it's going to take a beating, and that could be 50+%, or it could actually be 100%. Right? There's going to be certain airplanes that are going to be retired, and they're probably not going to come back out. Right? They're going to be put in the desert, and they're not going to be flown again. So I think so that's certainly kind of telling in terms of what could happen. But again, because each downturn is so different, it's not the end all say all to what's going to happen. So it's important to, I think, continue to listen to what everybody's talking about and trying to find, the points that will drive how the significance of the value declines. And to me, the simplest analysis that drives values is supply and demand, right? That's more airplanes that are available, the values go down, right? And it's just so from that standpoint, I think what remains parked is what's going to drive how values get impacted, going forward. Because right now, you can't really tell, when you have 55% of the fleet that's parked, that's not a good indication of if that remains that way, it's the end of the industry. I mean, come on. But that's not going to be the case. It's just a matter of what's going to come back out.
Would you like to kind of formally walk through the first slide?
Obviously, I think it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of, what that represents. Ultimately, it is a more generalized overview of what happened, but I think it gives you a good indication of, from the different aircraft categories in terms of, whether it's out of production or in production, single aisle versus, twin aisle or wide bodies, kind of what the extent of the declines were between each of the different downturns. It certainly doesn't look at every aircraft type that's out there. I think it's just more of the common types that were impacted based on the data that I had. And it looks at kind of the year over year, value decline. And so that way it kind of tells you, over the following 12 months, after the start of each downturn, kind of what happened to the values of those aircraft. Again, I think that kind of shows you what some of the possibilities are in terms of the value declines. And keep in mind that, with each of those, typically the lower end of that range is going to be more for the younger types, and obviously the bigger is going to be for the older types of that particular variant. So,
well, what stuck out to me, I mean, the differences between the value changes in 9/11 versus the financial crisis, in particular the in production aircraft, both the single and the twin aisle. In the financial crisis versus 9/11, the single aisle in production aircraft took a disproportionate hit. in values when compared to their twin aisle brothers, if you will, siblings. Yeah, and we kind of saw the opposite of that on the out of production aircraft. So it seems that from that crisis, we saw a lot more out of production single aisle aircraft retain value, relatively speaking. I mean, they still fell quite a bit, but relatively speaking to 9/11. But then on the wide body side, we saw for the single aisle and the twin were flipped in terms of where the hit came, whether the hit came to in production aircraft, which was the case with the single aisle, but on the twin aisle it was the out of production aircraft that took such hit, up to 60% in their values.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also, I mean, keep in mind for the in production single aisle aircraft, the higher percentages is really driven by the older A320s, which at that point, that fleet really needs to be broken down in terms of, kind of the first 7 to 10 years, and then the younger stuff, because that compares really between the classics and the NGs. But it's still viewed as an in production aircraft, right? So from that standpoint, the older aircraft, meaning late 80s, early 90s airplanes, were viewed as the older types. They were more available, and so that's what took the bigger hit. So that if you really were to break that down, further in terms of looking at each variance, where you take out the older A320s out of that, the numbers, kind of certainly go down to a certain extent. But yeah, I think that it is interesting to kind of see how during the financial crisis, the wide bodies, especially the in production types, were not hit as hard, and it's interesting to see if that's going to occur during this crisis, where you're going to have less of an impact for some of the younger wide bodies that are out there that are still in production. To me, a lot of it is driven by kind of where the traffic's coming from. If it's domestic versus international, that's kind of where the demand's going to be. So
I guess some speculation, just because I find this fascinating. First, the one thing that I wanted to point out, in this chart, when you're talking about out of production single aisle aircraft in 2001 and 2002, these are like DC-9s and of course the MD-80s, but even 727s are in there. I mean, this was a generation ago. You still had some 3-engine aircraft in there. I mean, that was the time that those finally left the fleets. I mean, even Delta Airlines had 727s that were operating in that range.
Yeah.
Further then to the in production twin aisle aircraft, again, just some context that occurred to me that I find fascinating. This was kind of in the middle of the 787 delays, with where the aircraft that you did have coming off the line were kind of there until the 787 really kicked in, and of course it did ultimately prove a success, but that was kind of that unique situation in that time as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think if you if you look around the financial crisis in terms of what new wide bodies were really out there, it wasn't as significant, I think, as what we're seeing today in terms of the new types that are out there. And I think this time around, really, there was a reordering wave for wide bodies at the beginning of the decade, after the financial crisis, which to me was very telling in terms of the reason why maybe there was a less of an impact for in production aircraft during the financial crisis, was that airlines hadn't gone through the process of reordering aircraft that they felt they needed, and so whatever they had, they felt that they still needed at that point, right? So it was less likely for them to just get out of whatever they had and focus on the newer stuff, and versus kind of some of the other downturns where maybe that wasn't the case.
And I think what's very important to point out in this context is we are entering this crisis with an oversupply and overproduction of wide-body aircraft, and the crisis has hit disproportionately on the international side with the pandemic. This is not a good time for wide-bodies. On the lease rate side, as I just kind of flip forward a slide, we're seeing a lot of the same relative type changes that you were expecting from the actual values.
Certainly, I think if you look at putting aside the Gulf War, just because weren't as many aircraft types available at that point. So from that standpoint, right, you could definitely see that around 9/11, I think the impact was greater, on the lease rate side than it was during the financial crisis. So we'll see what happens now, but I think there is a greater sense that capacity is going to be hit a lot harder this time around. So I would expect to see probably a higher impact on lease rates. And again, but that just goes to show you how to not necessarily focus on the previous downturns, just because you just don't know what this time around is going to look like. But it's obviously the lease rates are typically what gets impacted first, in terms of there's always a lag in terms of how values will react. So it's definitely something that I think we're going to see probably a greater impact lease rates going forward than we did before, just because of I think where airlines need to be to make sense of their newly reorganized operations.
And how do you, thinking back 10 years, I now feel like, an old vet in this industry, because I recognize some of these crises, right? Like this, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But thinking back to the financial crisis, which again, wasn't that long ago, one of the differences in particular to the leasing market that seems to be the case, and maybe I'll ask you your take on this, but the amount of aircraft that were speculatively ordered and in the backlog for the OEMs, if I remember at the time, it felt like it was significantly smaller than the amount, especially on the narrow body side, that exists today. It felt like there were just a lot more, sale leasebacks were more profitable. Since then, just a lot more people have been getting into the space, right? Seeing the money that can be made. And as a result, it's driven more out, it's made that segment not as profitable and driven more people into the speculative side. Again, I mean, this is something that's easily looked at by numbers. It may prove me wrong overnight.
Yeah, no, and I think after the financial crisis, I think as things started to evolve and as the market started to recover, I think it became tougher for the lessors to put spec orders to make sense of them, just because I don't think the pricing was as attractive as perhaps it was during 9/11. As the space recovered and as more players entered the space, right? Then the sale and leaseback market then became very competitive, and so there was also that drive of do we go in with our own with the speculative order to be able to have some balance in terms of what we're able to do versus kind of looking at just going with an operator based on their spec, based on what they're looking for, or do we kind of try to play the market with our own orders to be able to satisfy the need by somebody else but the need by the airlines where another lessor may not be able to do that because they don't have the orders in place. So I think there's a couple of things that were kind of taking place there, where spec orders maybe made a little bit more sense, but a lot of it is also driven just by purely what kind of volume discounts can the lessors get, and it's a little bit tough to justify, the pricing that you can get when things are being better versus an airline that will typically get preferential pricing because it's one spec, right? So they're able to get a better volume discount.
A big difference for the lessors during this crisis could be the wave of aircraft without homes that are coming, either if they're unable to defer, cancel, or whatever. Those are also then going to effectively compete against the OEM, who are out there trying to sell aircraft to add to their backlog in their own right. And that's a challenge and a balance that OEMs, and the love-hate relationship between lessors and OEMs that has gone back to the dawn of time.
I think if you look back at previous downturns, I think one of the things that I've seen, especially having worked for a lessor at the beginning of my career, was that the manufacturers, took advantage of the relationships with the lessor, so that if they did have cancellations or default situations where they had kind of aircraft becoming available, they would work with the lessors to be able to, swap orders or do things so that, kind of using the lessors' relationships to be able to place those aircraft rather than just, building whitetails and having them sit there and having them trying to, sell those in the market and competing with the lessor space, working together. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that in this downturn as well. Although I will say that, I think, in Boeing's case, where specifically on the 737 MAX, where, they've got aircraft that they've built and haven't yet to deliver, certainly kind of brings up the question as, out of the 400 plus airplanes that are sitting there waiting to be delivered, how many of those are going to be in a situation where the operator just goes, look, it's great that you built this airplane for us, but I can't take it. I just don't have funds to be able to do it, nor do I have the need for it. And so does that create, whitetails once again, once the aircraft gets recertified and goes back in the air? And, there's a lot of things that need to happen, but I think that's going to be interesting to see what happens there, because that's a lot of airplanes.
Which, by the way, is not necessarily a different type of process than we would expect any other time or with the other production lines, where, regardless if the MAX is built or coming down the production line, an airline that doesn't need it is going to say, look, I don't need it, and they're going to try to negotiate a less disadvantageous outcome for themselves. The real challenge is that on day one of whenever the MAX can fly, you are going to have, what is this, like 400 aircraft, effectively trying to deliver on day one. Now, Boeing can't deliver all those aircraft on day one necessarily, but the backlog is going to be whatever it is, plus 400.
Yeah, look, and I think Boeing's, done their homework in terms of how to do that efficiently. And so they're not going to come out and, produce a ton of airplanes, coming out of the factory, along with trying to deliver airplanes that they've already built. They're going to balance that, of course. But it's certainly, it's been a concern in terms of like, okay, well, how many airplanes will come onto the market that will drive, at that point, if you're in a situation as an airline and you have to take the airplane because it's just something you can't get out of, then, you're certainly going to be looking at, all right, what other airplanes that we have in our fleet that we don't need. And if you've already, retired the aircraft that were unencumbered, and whether you've capitalized on that or whether you just stored them because it's just going to cost you money, then you start looking at, all right, well, aircraft that we have, leased are going to start being the target in terms of like, okay, well, we don't really need this airplane, so let's see if we can either terminate the lease early, or it's coming up for lease termination anyway, so we're just going to give it back. So that's going to drive the used availability, right? And so that's what's going to drive some of the valuation declines overall.
So I'd love to move into your current value trends forecast. I call it a forecast for April of 2020, but you kind of get the idea.
The trends that I've provided there is really based on some of the things that I talked about before, right? Where some of it is driven by actual data points that I've gotten, where where I've seen specifically on some newer aircraft or new aircraft where to be able to get the transaction done, pricing changed to be able to account for that, and so that's driving some of that. Other portions of that is going to also come in from some of the indicators that I talked about in terms of the airline risk going up, and so that drives kind of the bottom end of that adjustment. And then once you start getting into more of the out of production, used aircraft, that's when you start looking at the higher percentages where the decline in the part out values and the engine values is what is going to be driving a lot of those adjustments, tied to a couple of little data points here and there that kind of justify some of these adjustments as well, based on I think what people are trying to get done.
And so I think, just kind of looking at the numbers here, the takeaway that I take from this is you're suggesting that, and I think this should be no surprise to anybody, but twin aisle aircraft are going to be the values are going to be hit, at least relative to the single aisle aircraft, which again coincides with the traffic that we're seeing on the international long haul segment versus, say, the more domestic short haul stuff.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's, I think initially, because of the fact that you're probably going to have fewer, twin aisle wide body aircraft that re-enter the market, especially if international traffic is kept at a minimum. Until that traffic comes back, right? That's typically what the aircraft that are being flown on those routes. So that's going to have an impact versus, I think as domestic travel hopefully recovers first within certain regions, right? Then that's when you start to see more activity on the single aisle side of the, of the fleet. And so, hopefully that's why the numbers will probably be slightly less. I think some of the things that are also driving the potential impact on aircraft valuations is going to be, and again, that's looking at some of the differences between previous downturns and now. If you're an operator that has a need for whether it's single aisle kind of capability, you can't necessarily just, if you're flying a 737, you can't just really go to Boeing and say, hey, can you just give me another MAX? Right now you can't, right? So you don't have that newly available airplane that you can just go, we've an order book. And so in the interim, until the airplane goes back in the air and gets recertified, what do you go to? And so that may provide some stability in, things of 737NGs or younger A320s, where because of the delays that we've seen and on the NEO side or obviously the grounding on the MAX, right, that will play a role into the extent of the value declines. Obviously, the older types, I think, will get further impacted just based on the fact that they're going to start hitting certain milestones where they're going to be expensive to maintain. And so, from that standpoint, I think that's why you're seeing someone like American Airlines make the announcement that they're going to retire 76 737-800s that are 20 or give or take years old. Right? That's just from that standpoint, it makes sense that they're probably getting to the point where, yeah, you know what, hit certain heavy checks that are too expensive, or the engines on those, we can take them off and support the remaining fleet that we still have, right? So I think a lot of that is going on, which is going to, certainly drive the older vintages of that type to get further impacted by the values.
Like you said, cash is king, and that's, even though these are the assets which are fully unencumbered, they also represent some cash outlays. I guess this is a perfect segue into the retired or the aircraft retirements that will be coming up over the next couple of years. I'm fascinated by this list as any aviation geek would be. We're seeing some relatively young aircraft in here. I'm seeing the 737-900. Again, not necessarily young, 777-300s, but this is the first time we've really seen these aircraft considered aging in a crisis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess the way that I looked at this, right, and it was trying to figure out, how to provide more guidance to the market in terms of, what aircraft will potentially come out of the fleets. One of the main things that I started to think about was, again, because as airlines were talking about stopping work orders with the MROs, in terms of, hey, look, we don't want to spend money on maintenance. And although some airlines are still doing maintenance, but it's not, I think overall they've all kind of said the same thing, that, look, we're going to try to not spend as much money on aircraft to maintain them. So based on that, I kind of started to look at where the heavy checks would be for certain aircraft types, or where the engine shop visits would be, or, if there's any cyclic limitations, and started to kind of play around with those numbers to figure out, okay, so for the rest of this year, right, which aircraft, based on your typical, heavy maintenance intervals, what aircraft could potentially hit that based on age and based on, hours and cycles. And so that's kind of what that represents. And obviously having this chart kind of it's been around the block by now with a few other folks that have looked at it. I've gotten certainly some comments about, oh, do you think that this particular aircraft type is going to be completely retired, or and it's not really what this is saying. It's just saying, it's kind of showing the potential for the aircraft retirements based on the based on maintenance and based on, right. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be what everything is going to look like. There are certainly airlines that are continue to fly 737 classics, or older 767s, and so. But this was more of like, hey, if we, based on the message that's being sent out there by airlines that, we're gonna try to reduce our expenses on the maintenance side. Older aircraft are certainly going to be impacted by that, especially ones that have, heavier checks that are going to be due. And so that's what I was trying to kind of capture there in those numbers. And I think it's, it kind of shows you a interesting picture of what's going to be out there and what could potentially be retired based on that.
Yeah, there certainly is a masochistic element to this chart. I have to completely sympathize with putting this level of data and then showing it to a bunch of aviation people. I could imagine you could pick apart anything, but I also think that that's missing the point. By the way, I mean, exactly like you said, we're looking through a list of aircraft that are approaching heavy checks that maybe are not necessarily needed. The A380 is a clear example in there. You're looking at 20% of the fleet. Clearly that's a young fleet, but clearly in the new reality of what we're looking at, that could be a target, especially with the cost profile of sending that aircraft through heavy maintenance.
Yeah. And the comment that I've gotten on the A380, by the way, is that I was being way too optimistic about the type, because most people think that the aircraft is basically dead. Yeah, I disagree to a certain extent, because I think there will be a market for a number of these aircraft that can be filled. But again, this was not my own personal view based on what I think of an airplane. It was driven by just maintenance intervals, and so that's what that shows, right?
But that's my favorite airplane. There's not the A380 is not for sure, but I mean, look, in your defense, and I'm very sincere about this. Look, there's a price for anything. And everything has a price. So the A380, define retirement, right? The A380, is going to leave scheduled service in these places. And it's the Hajj airplane as an example, right? So does it enter more charter fleets, but it's still in service, right? And there's a price for everything. So the dynamic market will ebb and flow and accept some of these and not. I love your crystal ball, man. Yeah, I think you're crazy crazy brave for putting that out there. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Again, it's not, I think if I was to put this out there based on just my own personal views, that's different, right? But this is purely, I mean, I can justify this all day long, right? I can kind of look at this and go, yeah, I mean, look, if you're looking at it purely from a maintenance standpoint, and age, and which is what's being talked about in the industry in terms of what airlines are trying to not do is spend money on maintenance. Well, that's not the right way to say it, because you don't want to make the thing that they're not doing things that are safe. But they're obviously going to try to avoid the heavier expenses of the heavy maintenance on airplanes. To me, this chart makes sense, right? Is that going to look like that over the next 12 months or 3 years? It's going to look different, but this again gives you that nice potential of this is what it could look like based on, if you go with that mindset, airlines may remove aircraft in that way. And I've had people say, hey, I think I'm being a bit too aggressive with certain types, where I've had others that say, you know what, that's great, but I don't think it's going to be enough.
The real value of taking at a granular look like this is it really provides a window into your thinking. Right. I mean, that's the real value. Like, this is how I look at these assets. Not saying this is exactly what's going to happen, but this is how we would approach it. And these are the type of things that we do look for. I guess one step back from a retired aircraft that, of course, for a lot of aircraft today is the number of aircraft or the percentage of the fleet that is in storage. I know this is the last slide that you had prepared for. I love this. I love just complete changes of perspective, and this certainly requires one.
I think it's always interesting to see, as you go through downturns, how the rates change. And it's certainly very telling. One of the rules of thumb that that I've always looked at is, as aircraft kind of go into that, 10 plus percentage of the fleet, that then becomes into, you go into that soft market scenario, right? As you have more than 10%, that's when you kind of enter that, anything less than 5%, usually is used as typical, that's it's not uncommon. As you get into the 5-10%, right, then means the market is not getting any better. And then when it goes over 10%, right, that's when it really starts to get where you can have some significant impact. So I think it's interesting to look at that, to go, okay, well, once we were going into 9/11, you had, a little over 6% of the fleet that was stored. A year later, you were in the 10%. In 2003, you were also at close to 11%. And then, then you started to have the recovery, first half of 2004 is really when you started to see the change in the industry and the recovery happening. And you can kind of see that in the percentage going down. Same thing in 2008, right? You kind of go into it, a slightly higher number of aircraft that were parked at that point, kind of getting into that close to that 10% and then going back down. So looking at, overall, okay, well, what is, prior to the crisis in the end of 2019, we're in that 9% phase. And what does it look like today, right? And that's when the numbers kind of jumps up. I think, as I mentioned before, I wouldn't necessarily use that as kind of like, oh my God, the world's going to end, because that's not really that's not a realistic number. I think what it looks like a year from now, I think is what's going to be very telling. And that number, if you were going into it at around 9% prior to the crisis, a year from now, right, it's probably going to it's going to go up from there, right? So that's going to be interesting to see what that number is, and that's going to be indicative of ultimately what the airlines need to be able to have a break even initially and profitable operation going forward, right? As they've all said, we're going to come out smaller, so that means that the number of parked aircraft is going to go up.
So the number that just jumps out of this chart, clearly, over half the fleet right now is no longer needed. However, of course not, right? In the peak, that it really doesn't mean much. It just means that, clearly the industry is not going to be able to stay here. But what I think is easily missed, and by far the most interesting point in this chart, is we were at 9% even going into the crisis. Not even going into it, before anybody even heard, the term COVID-19, that is. We were at 9% at the start of 2020, which was, 0.5% below where we were at the peak of the financial crisis in terms of stored aircraft. So now there are any number of reasons for that, but I think that gives you a baseline from which to say, okay, now that we know, or now that we may have a picture of how demand may return after that, the number of stored aircraft is going to increase proportionally. No, it's not going to be 55%, although it is just staggering to see that's the fleet that's currently on the ground. But we're starting at 9, like you suggested. Does that mean 11? Does that mean 15? Does that mean higher than that? We don't know. It's that starting point that it easily gets missed of 9% at the height of what really is the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's and I think what drives a lot of that is the ability, I think, for the manufacturers all around to produce more airplanes over the last 20 years, right? And I think that's what drives that bigger number.
Let me ask you this: are the maxes included in that?
That is a good question. I would say yes. Although, when you're looking at a fleet of, 50,000+ airplanes, does having 300 and something on the ground or even 800 on the ground really make a huge difference?
You know what? That's actually a great point. And you're absolutely right. Not only that, but, there were other aircraft kept flying that would have been in storage had those aircraft delivered. So it's kind of a closed loop. You're right. Yeah,
it is. I mean, but, I think you can, it's easy to dissect, things further, right? This is, for me, it's more of like a general overview. of what's out there. Once you really kind of dig into it, you could probably get a much more accurate sense of like, all right, now this is what it really was. But this from a macro, view, it's a good. I think it's a good picture to kind of go, okay, well, this is kind of what it's looked like over the last couple of downturns, and this is where we were going into it. Where is it going to end up?
And I'm actually going to disagree with you on a semantics point. And that is what you said was you can get a much more accurate view by drilling down. And I disagree. You'll get a more precise view. And I think the difference is important because the way you said it implies that this isn't accurate. And I disagree with that. I think this is very accurate. That's the definition of accuracy over precision, and I think that's why you get a lot of pushback as people try to define precise points in what is a very directionally accurate analysis. So no, I'm right there with you, and I think this is spot on.
I will say this, I think communication during any crisis or this crisis specifically is the key to survival, right? And so the more I communicate my thoughts and get feedback from others, the better off I'm going to be, because I usually learn something when I talk to somebody. So I'm always happy to talk to somebody.
Gueric, thank you. Again, that was Gueric Dechavanne from Collateral Verifications. You can find Gueric through his website at cvllc.net. Gueric, of course, is an ISTAT Certified Senior Appraiser. With that, Gueric, truly, thank you. Thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.